So let's start off with this. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Simply Neuroscience's event on architectural psychology with Professor David Canter. David Canter is an emeritus professor at the University of Liverpool. He was one of the founders of environmental psychology in the UK and Europe. He was also very influential in North America and elsewhere. He founded the leading Journal of Environmental Psychology, co-founded the IAPS, which is the International Association of People Environment Studies, which is the primary professional environment behavior research organization in Europe, and established the MSc in environmental psychology at the University of Surrey, which is the leading program in the UK and one of the leading programs internationally. So he has also been influential around the world. Not only has he written applied and theoretical work, which have given a great impact, but he has influenced many of his students who have gone on to be leaders in the field. So he built on his work in environmental psychology to develop the new discipline of investigative psychology as well. Professor Canter has published over 100 academic and professional papers, as well as 24 books in environmental and architectural psychology. He has contributed to many newspapers, television and radio documentaries, and news programs. He is an honorary fellow of the British Psychological Society and a fellow of both the American Psychological Association, the Academy of Social Science, and the Royal Society of Medicine. Okay, those were a lot of words, but Professor Canter, on to you.
Okay, you've got two people waiting to come in that you need to admit.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. It's great to have the opportunity to talk to you about architectural psychology. I'm going to do this very quickly and very briefly, but I think it's useful for you to understand that it has its origins in very practical problems. And it was actually architects who began to ask for guidance, as well as government departments looking for advice on the development of buildings. You perhaps don't appreciate that 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, buildings were designed by people without taking too much consideration of the users of those buildings. They really had patterns, and they had styles, and they had their own idea of what was aesthetically acceptable. But it was after the Second World War, with huge devastation in Europe, that the government realized that they needed to have a framework for giving guidance on the new buildings that would be built. And this was in part because of a growth in democratic processes. The idea that it was not just acceptable for the aristocracy or senior people to decide on how others should live, but that the individuals, the society needed itself to have an influence over the shaping of its houses and its buildings. And therefore, in a number of countries, particularly in Britain and in Northern Europe, there were studies carried out about how people lived their lives with the intention of giving guidance on sizes, on the amount of daylight that should come in, on the different types of rooms that people should need, particularly in housing, as well as beginning to think about planning in a much broader sense in terms of the rebuilding cities. And one of the consequences in Britain was a development towards the idea of a much more scientific support for architectural activity. It was argued that architecture was just something people would have an idea for a building, it would be built, and that would be it. They would then move on to the next building. But there was no real evaluation of what was built. And there was a big festival in Britain in 1951 that was very much about the introduction of science into all walks of life into many different areas, and the belief that scientific activity could help to produce a much better, safer, more comfortable and more pleasing society than had existed and been destroyed by the two major world wars. And this idea spread around the world with a search for much more systematic and scientific approaches to planning and all aspects of design. And there was I'll just go through this very quickly, but it was very important in Britain. It was actually a civil servant, not a sociologist, not a psychologist, not an architect, who carried out a survey with the objective of homes for today and tomorrow. And I think that's the interesting aspect about this, that the perspective of the research was how can we create much more acceptable and much more comfortable environments. And at the heart of this was the exploration of people's experiences of their environment, what they felt about it and what they did and how they used it and what it meant to them. And that became a part of the whole exploration of the buildings and cities with a view of influencing the whole design and decision-making process. And I got caught up with an organization that was looking at office buildings, because there was a huge campaign to develop new office buildings in Britain in the 1960s. And as part of this, a new Act of Parliament was coming in that would shape how much space each individual should have around their desk, how much lighting they should have, how much, what the heating should be. In other words, to give controls that buildings had to achieve a minimum standard that buildings had to achieve. And this idea became apparent in America. They were doing similar things, and particularly in Scandinavia. There are still countries in the world which are less focused on trying to have rules in place, laws that require the amount of space that a minimum amount of space that a person should have in their working environment, noise levels, heating levels, and so on. But that was very much in the 60s a move towards creating more safe, comfortable, and pleasant environments for the workforce. This was my supervisor actually for my PhD, Brian Wells. Having discussions with people about their working environment, beginning to think about what could be an appropriate way of designing it. And he developed scientific procedures of showing people plans for offices, asking them where they would prefer to sit, and other issues about people's preferences and aspirations in terms of their use of office space. And out of this, a book later came that I became very involved in. We studied school buildings and guidance for school buildings in Scotland. And you can see the aim was on performance of the building. And this whole idea of building evaluation has continued, and there are many books on the evaluation of buildings, which relate very much to the experience of the users of those buildings and the particular patterns of activities in which they were engaged. And there are a number of psychological studies that became influential. In the 1960s in particular, when I started my PhD and began to do research in this area, there were 3 or 4 books that were really very, very significant. And one of them was the book by Robert Sommer, who sadly died quite recently, in which he introduced the idea of personal space, this idea that we all have around us a comfortable sort of space in which we operate, that we keep, this was before social distancing and the whole introduction around the COVID, the idea that if you look at people waiting for a bus, they will tend to stand at a particular comfortable distance from each other. If you look in a waiting room at an airport, in a train station, in a bus station, you will see people will normally keep a certain distance from each other. And this idea that there's some sort of bubble around the person that we each carry with us was one that Sommer explored very much in relation to the idea that this could influence the whole design process. The term personal space actually comes from looking at birds, because when birds nest, they have to have the distance that allows their wings to actually fold or land properly. So if you look at a colony of birds, there will be natural distances between the birds in relation to their ability to flap their wings and leave their nest. And Sommer took that idea and began to do many studies of how people use space and their activities in a variety of different situations, and how the layout of furniture can influence how people relate to each other. If chairs are facing each other, people are more likely to talk to each other than if they're apart. So that was one of the ideas of looking at how people use space that began to be part and parcel of thinking about the whole design process. I started putting together ideas on architectural psychology. This is a conference I organized in 1969, in which I first conference to bring together a whole range of ideas. And it's just interesting that to show that people were beginning to think about how do we explain people's relationship to their physical environment? What sort of theories may be appropriate? And for example, many people naively believe that the physical environment just influences behavior. If they have a room of particular color, it will influence your mood. Or a particular layout of a building will have a special way of making you feel. And that was called determinism, architectural determinism. I said if you have two chairs facing each other, then people are more likely to talk to each other. Well, that is a sort of deterministic idea. And it doesn't always work, of course, because if they don't know each other, or if it's a tradition, a culture in which people don't talk to each other, then the layout won't make any difference. I have to tell the story of being in a small hotel with a few tables, and we would go down to breakfast, and the first morning there were people at the different tables and nobody spoke to each other. The next morning there was an American couple in the room, and within 5 minutes everybody was talking to each other, because it's much more part of the American tradition to open up contact with other people than it is with the British tradition. So there are all sorts of cultural influences on the distances people keep from each other, how they interact with each other. And that's one of the reasons why the deterministic idea, the idea that physical environment shapes behavior, is actually misleading. And a whole range of different theories began to emerge. But the other thing we were looking at is studies of what temperature is comfortable for people and how that influences people, visibility and privacy, the roles of that, and a variety of other sorts of explorations of the acoustic environment, beginning to build up a picture of the psychological consequences of all sorts of different aspects of the built environment. And one of the things that I began to develop was to challenge this deterministic idea that really users of buildings are just subjects that can be manipulated, and by the layout of the building, you can just actually make people behave in a particular way. And that's dealing with them as objects who really don't bring any sense to that building, don't make sense of what's going on, don't have objectives and aspirations, and therefore are going to make use of the building. So it's really treating them as people experiencing things as subjects, and that became the part of the development of a theory, thinking of buildings, of how buildings operate, as keeping the bad things out and the nice things in, keeping the rain out and the cold out, or in hot countries keeping the heat out, acting as a support for social activities, and very importantly, as a symbol, as carrying some significance, some meaning. And this became an increasingly important idea. And in fact, in the 1960s, architects were still talking in terms of the form of a building being totally shaped by its function. Form follows function was the sort of mantra, the slogan of architecture. But it was partly through psychological research that we began to say to architects, well, hang on, buildings have meanings, they have significance, they have a history and a culture. And a building is never only a representation of what goes on within it in some simple functional way. And actually, the development in modern architecture is reflected that architects are much more aware of how they're manipulating all sorts of ideas of meaning and identity. And so we began to develop much more ideas about the different ways in which architecture has its influence, and beginning to develop methodologies for studying the subjective meaning of rooms, and how people react to outdoor scenes, and various more sophisticated ways of exploring ways in which people make sense of their surroundings. And this became an important part of architectural psychology. And what happened in the late 60s and developed in the 70s is in the United States, they began to refer to environmental psychology. Because if you're talking about heating, and you're talking about the view from the window, and you're talking about how people find their way around cities, the term architecture was regarded as too limited. And so they began to talk about an environmental psychology, a much broader based psychology. And it's important to mention now that that idea has begun to dominate the whole area, so that because of climate change, because of environmental degradation, and because so much of that relates to what people do and to human behavior, that really the many psychologists in this area, I would say the majority now, are looking at human behavior and human experience and activities and attitudes in relation to environmental change and climate degradation, climate change, and so on. And so environmental psychology, I call it, it's become green environmental psychology, which really came out of this earlier architectural psychology, but is really quite different now. But I'm focusing today really mainly on architectural psychology, although in the limited time available, I hope I'll give some indication of why looking at how people make sense of, experience, and use the environment actually helps us to understand the challenge of dealing with environmental change. I was teaching in a school of architecture and realized that there were many aspects of architecture that would benefit from some understanding of psychology. So I wrote a book, Psychology for Architects, which was in print for many years. And it started off with ideas of perception, but also dealt a lot with social psychology, the idea that buildings, architecture has a social relevance, a social significance for how people relate to each other. It's not just a visual perceptual phenomenon. There are books now that talk about neuroscience aspects of architecture, drawing on a sort of neuroscientific, psychological interpretation. Quite honestly, I think it's really rather silly, most of that, because we're dealing with a very complex human cognitive, social, cultural processes that shape how we relate to each other and how we relate to the world. And of course, there will be aspects of the brain that reflect those processes, but those aspects of the brain don't help us to understand it any better. That might seem an outrageous thing to say in a Simply Neuroscience conference, but it's something I've written about, and there are papers available where I've challenged the whole idea of interpreting complex psychological, social, and cultural phenomena, interpreting them only in terms of which bit of the brain lights up under different circumstances. So the psychology for architects deals with organizational psychology, as well as social psychology and developmental psychology. And we began to start looking at understanding the city, living in cities, and even the natural environment and people's reactions to that. So we're beginning to build up a much more complex set of ideas about the experiences of the physical surroundings. And interestingly, those ideas around meaning and interpretation began to find their way into architecture, and a whole development in architecture that became known as postmodern architecture reflected. I'm not saying the psychologists caused it, but it did. That was part of the environment in the early 70s that began to influence how architects thought about what they were doing. So the idea of the form follows function, the architectural slogan, really was shown to not make very much sense at all. And so they would begin to look at how architecture had significance. And quite an interesting book in the late 60s, one of the besides Robert Summers' Personal Space, the other significant book was a book by Amos Rappaport, an architect originally, but very much an anthropological argument that the form of houses around the world relate to the culture. And this came as a bit of a shock to architects, that really they were used to the idea that housing in particular related to particular needs and requirements. And Rappaport demonstrated that this wasn't the case, that the culture influenced house form, and that was part of this whole movement towards exploring the meaning of buildings and their social significance. And I started doing little experimental studies, for instance, which these are models of rooms. We showed people these different models and asked them how friendly was the room. And actually, we're able to show that a sloping ceiling in certain cultures carries meanings of empathy and closeness and casualness that a flat ceiling doesn't. It turned out to be much more complicated than that. But that was the beginning, and a number of theorists, architects, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists began to develop these ideas in a much richer sort of way. And curiously, in the late 1990s now, after being involved in that research for a long time, I was asked to contribute to a police investigation into a series of rapes and murders. And I built up this idea that we build a shape, an understanding of where we live that is a mental representation of that, that relates to what we want to achieve, what we want to do. And that whole cognitive map, in a sense, reflects our experiences. And I thought that would be relevant when looking at somebody who had carried out a series of rapes and murders around London. And that those locations would tell us about his mental representation. And importantly, at the heart of that would be where he was living. because that would shape how he built up this picture and understanding of the environment. And so I use those ideas with the police I just go through this very quickly because this is a whole other series of lectures. Looking at where things occurred and making inferences, particularly about the individual. This became, Sam Gosling did a book on this that was just about how rooms tell us about the characteristics of people, what your stuff says about you, following up from those earlier studies that I mentioned about looking at how rooms carry meanings for people. But the work I did with the police enabled me to build up a picture of where the crimes had occurred and suggest the location where the offender was living. And the police had a number of people that were suspects that they found in police records who committed similar crimes. And only one of them really related to that particular location. And that enabled them to then focus on that individual and in fact get enough evidence to show that indeed that he was the culprit. So that was quite an exciting area of the development of environmental psychology. And because I'd been involved in developing environmental psychology earlier, as I showed you from all these earlier books, I began to develop the idea of an investigative psychology that really related to how you can use psychological ideas to support all sorts of investigations. So that was a spin-off from this that actually I've written a lot of books about and worked with the police on various things. But I'm trying to get away from rape and murder. The pictures in environmental psychology are much nicer. So I'm not talking about that today, but really about the development of an architectural psychology that really looks at how people interact with their surroundings and make sense of them. That relates to who they think they are and how they really see themselves operating. And at the heart of this is the way in which places are given meaning by culture, history, in this case, religion, really carries through beyond the simple physical structure. And a lot of this people bring with them to the situation, so that they're transacting with the situation. They're not just shaped by it. They're imposing a sense on it. And we use a procedure, giving people pictures, asking them to sort them and organize them, and then do statistical analysis that allows us to see the different sorts of meanings that places can have. In this case, we were looking at countryside locations in terms of planning activities and what people use the countryside for. And this, there were groups that are very local for them, very convenient, easy places to get to, others that they'd go to because they're tranquil and picturesque, and yet others that have a sort of functional activity in terms of jogging or hiking or bike riding. So that's just a little illustration of the sort of research that we've been doing to bring out what it is that people are doing and how they're making sense of places and how they're taking with them a certain set of purposes, objectives to give those places significance. This was originally cast in my book, The Psychology of Place, which I'm now working on doing a totally new edition of, which is quite intriguing to do 40 years or more after the original book. And one of the reasons I was happy to do this talk, because I'm working with a lot of this new material now. At the heart of this book was this idea that places are really a creative interpretation that people have. that they know what sort of place it is. They have ideas about what might happen there. This is partly influenced by the physical form and what's possible. And that gives rise to actions that people will carry out in those places, which feed into their understanding and their conceptualization. So the idea is that places are this combination of action, meaning, and physical form. And that when we're talking about places, we're talking about an abstraction. We're not just talking about a particular location. And it's really interesting when you look into the word place in many different languages. It takes on all sorts of richness and meaning. I won't go into that now, but the concept of place in English is a very interestingly ambiguous one. We can use it place for all sorts of different meanings, and that's because it captures a set of ideas, aspects of experience, and indeed indications of who we are. If you're in an office in the top of the building, you probably think you're somebody much more significant than if you're in a place that carries much less status. So there are all these issues that relate to how we form our understanding and experiences of places. So the meaning of place is defined as much by human action as by location and form. So for instance, this is just one example I like. This is the Golden Gate Bridge, which normally would have traffic flowing on it. But it's a totally different place when it's used for the San Francisco Marathon or jogging activity. It changes its meaning completely because of the human activity involved. These are my two children many, many years ago, changing the meaning of this little ledge outside a showroom. They bring about a totally different significance. This young lady now is the head of production at Netflix. But that just shows you how places are given meaning by what people interpret and the activities that they impose upon them. I've done a study over the years of where people sleep in public places, but you can see how this individual has given meaning to this place and has even left his shoes, his sandals, just in a particular location where he's lying out of the sun, of course, but in a more secluded, somewhat more private place. He's defined that as a location in which sleeping is appropriate. And there are rules associated with that that relate to anticipated actions. And this, there are a couple of more examples I'll give of the power of this idea of the psychology of place. This was a fire in King's Cross Underground Station in 1987, in which 31 people died. And when we did a study of where people had moved during the fire, what we found was the fire came up the escalators and people were moving up into this ticket hall. But what we found is that the individuals, the routes, where this is where the bodies were found. And the bodies were all found in locations that related to the route people were taking. So although there was smoke and flames and heat and what people may call panic, though it's not a very useful term, actually people were still moving, following the rules that they knew and that they took part in relation to that whole experience. This was another example of the way in which the rules of place gave rise to an understanding of the whole experience of the football ground. I mean, this was a terrible situation in 1988 when people were killed because of crowds moving forward in a football ground in England. This was a book that was published just a couple of months later. And this was the picture that the designer had already selected. Because of what we said in the book, we predicted, because of the pattern of place use, because of people's expectations of football, we predicted there was going to be some sort of disaster, and in fact made many suggestions about the whole layout of football grounds to carry meaning about what is expected of people there, that were actually put into the law in Britain, and they did save. They didn't. There were some other disasters, but there weren't. There wasn't the scale of problem that there had been up until that point. So I'll just finally finally say that talking very much about a sort of action research, about the way in which the research questions come from recognized problems in the world, and the information, the data actually has to be based on the information that's there in the world for people to deal with, and that the results really have to open up options for the decision makers and the planners and the architects and designers. And that's the way in which psychology has its impact, rather than doing a research, publishing the results and assuming that that's going to have some impact. That's not the way in which psychology can be relevant. That's one of my sculptures. Thanks very much. So I leave it to questions now.
Thank you so much, Professor Canter. We can start off with questions from the audience right now. If you would be willing to unmute your mic or even send a message in the chat, we would be entertaining those questions.
I'm pretty interested. I had a question on how you actually perform your studies. So you briefly touched on this, but like, how would an experiment or like a study be conducted on how people perceive a specific building or a place?
Yeah, it's perhaps a more important and interesting question than you realize, because it is actually quite difficult for people to express, to articulate their relations to places. It's not part of our vocabulary. And psychology has been very bad, actually. If you take a book in psychology, it's very rare that they refer to the environment at all. Psychologists operate as if it's some sort of just neutral, open sort of non-existent place. So it is a real challenge. The usual methods available in psychology have been used very widely. Questionnaires, asking people their opinions, and very structured processes. I mentioned the multiple sorting tasks that we use, where you have lots of cards, pictures of places, and you ask people to organize them around various themes. And from that, you can draw out their understanding of the meaning of those places. You can observe people and watch their patterns of use, which are often referred to as behavioral mapping, which can be very effective. I mean, there are now a couple of books, one by an ex-student of mine, Linda Grote, on research in architecture. So the people have explored a whole variety of different procedures. I always like to mention a quite fun approach that was first described in a book called Unobtrusive Measures. Because the idea is in psychology that if you interact with people and ask them questions, or even they see you observing them, they're going to change their behavior. So can you develop any techniques that will tell you something about their experiences and activities that doesn't interact with them? And so there was a whole movement to try and do that. It's very difficult because you can't really pick up meaning without some form of interaction with people. But I always like to mention this little example where they looked at exhibits in a museum, and they looked at nose prints against the glass of the exhibit, and saw how many there were, to see how interested people were in that exhibit. But rather nicely, they measured the height of the nose print, and from that they could work out the age, the average age of the person looking into that exhibit. So, I mean, people have tried those sorts of procedures, but in the end, talking to people, exploring with people the experiences is is crucial. I've recently, in my new book, I've been actually looking at writings of artists, and that's been very interesting. Just writing of novelists or of poets, or of even people commenting, for instance, on the landscape and its significance. And I think psychologists have been very bad at thinking that their way of doing things is the only way of getting access to people's understanding and experience. And in fact, at the moment, I'm very much involved in composing music. And I'm also looking at how composers actually relate to, particularly to the landscape, as a way of enriching our understanding of how landscape has meaning. So I don't think it's only limited to the conventional psychological procedures. Of course, there's a huge amount of experimental study that carries out, where people are shown pictures and asked to react to them, and even now they follow eye movement and get people to make judgments in relation to the pictures. As you probably gathered, I'm a little anxious about that, although I have done research of that kind, because what you don't create when somebody's looking at a picture is the reason for them being there. They're there as experimental subjects. And to me, that really misses the central way we relate to our surroundings. It's why we're there. The purpose for being there is actually a crucial aspect of understanding people's experience and use of places. And it's very difficult to simulate that by just showing people a picture. Anything else? Any other questions?
Yeah, so could you tell us more about what you personally did in the UK and Europe to bring environmental and architectural psychology into the mainstream, and what your future plans are, if not yours, for the future generation of psychologists?
Environmental psychology, looking at people's attitudes to climate change and their behavior, is becoming mainstream. I've just heard of two absolutely major research projects that really $5 million being funded. One project in Europe, based in Spain, and another in Britain. And that's becoming mainstream now because people realize that the people's behavior is absolutely crucial, and people's attitudes are crucial to dealing with it and climate change. So in a sense, that has become the focus of environmental psychology. I personally feel that they've missed often an understanding of the sort of issues I've been talking about, of how our interactions with the environment are part of who we are and the way we think of ourselves, and that you have to get back to those fundamental psychological issues in order to understand how you modify people's behavior in relation to climate change. My activity, the main influence I had was setting up a master's program initially in 1971, I think it was, at the University of Surrey in environmental psychology, and then having loads of PhD students, many of whom are now professors around the world. And that is very influential. It also seems that the books I've written, people seem to take quite significantly. In fact, The Psychology of Place, which, as I said, was published in 1977, is still the most highly cited of my publications. So I've always been impressed by how publication can be much more influential than you realize. I published very early on in 1969, I think it was, in a small journal, the Proceedings of the Bartlett Society. I published a paper, and I was very fortunate to have a fellowship that took me to Japan. And I was looking for help to set up research in architecture, in architectural psychology in Japan. And I went to see a major architect and professor of architecture at the major Tokyo Daigaku, the major university. And I explained to him what my interests were. And he took a journal off the shelf. He said, "Oh, that's very interesting. I've just read a very interesting paper about that that seems to deal with it." And I said, "Oh, well, that's the paper I wrote." And I was quite amazed that it had found all the way to him. And of course, after that, he couldn't do enough for me. He was so pleased to be able to help me. And it was that publication that gave some sort of authority, in a sense. So I have done some guidance on design projects, but almost invariably the projects don't come into existence for all sorts of reasons, nothing to do with me. So yeah, there are those possibilities. But I think the idea of an architectural psychology that architects and designers and planners get to hear about influences their thoughts about things. And certainly now there's a great movement of what they call placemaking. Instead of thinking about a building or a planning activity as the shaping of forms, they think of it as creating places. So I think the ideas can be very powerful. There was a leading applied psychologist who said, there's nothing so applicable as a good theory. And theories have much greater influence than a simple set of findings.
Okay, perfect. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Okay, if not, let me ask just one more question. So you were talking about research. What do you think is the best way to get into research in architectural psychology, as we have many students in the audience right now?
Well, it's finding a course. It's typically a postgraduate activity because it's still not a dominant part of undergraduate training. Undergraduate courses, I don't know of any undergraduate courses that have anything other than possibly one course in environmental psychology in their final year. So it's a matter of finding postgraduate courses or studying with an individual. Again, it's relatively unusual for there to be a group of environmental psychologists in a university. Typically, it's one or possibly two individuals who you can study with. So you need, university activities, there are all sorts of decisions that have to be made. But one of the decisions to be made is where you want to be. And then having decided where you want to study is to look at what the opportunities are in that area for study in relation to these sorts of issues. And at University of Surrey, that is still, I think it's the only university in Britain, I think, that still has a master's program in environmental psychology. There may be others that relate in various ways. And of course, geographers get into everything. So many geography courses will deal with some of these issues. But it is a postgraduate activity, really. And certainly you can, if you do an undergraduate psychology, sociology, anthropology degree, the chances are you could do a final year project that was an architectural or environmental psychology project. So you can step into the water that way. But it's still not mainstream in the way many other areas of psychology are.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So since we've wrapped up with all the questions, I guess we can wrap up with this session. Thank you so much to all the participants, and obviously Professor David Canter for being here and sharing some insightful knowledge to us. And it's been 1 hour since we started the meeting. So have a nice day, guys. Okay, we have one question over here. Where can I get a copy of Psychology of the Place?
Sorry? Oh, there is an ebook version of it on Amazon. If you have any difficulty locating it, I did put up my web address and my email address, but there is an ebook version that I prepared available on Amazon. That's probably the best way. Sometimes you can buy secondhand copies around and about. Last time I looked, though, they were very expensive. That's why I put the ebook. It was published in 1977. So, and it was actually published by a publisher that doesn't exist anymore, the Architectural Press. But then, or you could wait for a year or so until my new edition is out, which will be very different from the first one.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, I can see that we don't. Okay, I guess we can wrap up now.
Well, thank you, Vishnu, for organizing this.
Likewise.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much to all the participants. Have a nice day, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.